What's up guys, and welcome to episode 4 of YouTube's I Build the £150 Gaming PC Challenge. Today's entry is a little bit different to our previous entries because this time it is our very first all AMD build. But before we jump into the parts of this, let's meet the contestant.
Hello, you want your PC Jack? Sorry, TechLab UK. So today, I've been kindly asked to provide a parts list for today's video. So, here it goes. We have an RTX 4090, a Core i9 14900K, 64GB of memory, and... wait, the budget is 150 quid. Well, back to drawing board I guess. I'm sure we'll figure out, so back to TechLab.
So as I said before, today's system is a little bit different because this time the contestant went for an all AMD build. It is the first all AMD build that we've actually had in this competition. So hopefully AMD can pull it out the bag here and at least make some progress on those leaderboards. Putting this system together was actually a bit of a challenge for our contestant because of course it is a much more modern platform. We are talking about AM4 here. It's not the latest, but it is reasonably more modern than all of the previous contestants, and only having a budget of £150 really means that you are extremely restricted on what you can buy. But he managed to pull it off, and he pulled off something which, in my opinion, is a pretty clean build. With only a budget of £150, our contestants are very limited on what they can purchase, and it really does go to show in some of the tiers of products that we've got here. For the motherboard, we've got a very basic MSI A320A, that's an AM4 motherboard. Very basic in terms of features. It doesn't even have an M.2 slot, but it's enough to be able to get this system up and running. At the heart of it, we have an AMD Ryzen processor, but this time it is actually an APU. We've got the AMD Ryzen 5 2400G. Now that is not the fastest Ryzen processor out there, but it's also not the slowest, so hopefully it will be enough for the graphics card that we've got today and to be able to produce some pretty decent results. Pairing up with this CPU is 16GB of DDR4 RAM. That is running in dual channel, so that's 2 sticks of 8GB. It is running at 3200 MHz, so it's going to give this CPU the best chance that it has. For storage, the contestant went with pretty much the same as everybody else, a 250GB SATA SSD, more than enough to get a system up and running and of course play games from. And then we've got the graphics card. Now the graphics card is of course the most important piece of any gaming PC, and I think our contestant did pretty well with this. And for that we have the AMD Radeon RX 570. Now originally our contestant was looking at the 4GB versions purely down to the amount of money that they had left, and they are pretty cheap nowadays, but at the last minute he managed to score a pretty decent one because this is actually an 8GB version. That is going to make all of the difference when it comes to testing the games that we've got, and we've proven that in the previous videos, so I think he kind of looked out there and it's going to make a pretty decent pairing all through. The exact graphics card that he managed to pick up here was actually the XFX model, and it's pretty decent. It's got a backplate, it stays nice and cool, it's a dual fan configuration, and they are reasonably low powered as well, only accepting one 8-pin connection, so that is pretty decent. And like I said before, the system came out extremely clean. Of course contestants also need to provide their own cooling solution, and fortunately for our contestant today, they managed to get an AMD Wraith Stealth, and that actually came with the CPU itself, so they saved a little bit on the cooler there, and it's decent enough performance. It actually performs okay with this system. There's no heat issues at all, so he kind of looked out a little bit there too. Now aside from the big question of how well this system will perform, particularly against our competition test suite, how much did our contestant actually spend? All of the components that our contestant picked today actually came from eBay, and he managed to find some pretty decent bargains. For the AMD Ryzen 5 2400G, managed to pick that up for £24.99. That's actually a pretty decent price for a processor here. It is a 4-core 8-thread processor, or at least APU, and it was released in around 2018, so it's not as old as any of the previous entries. The MSI A320MK Pro motherboard cost £30 from eBay. 16GB of DDR4 cost him £24 from eBay. The 250GB SATA SSD only cost him £14.96. And then for the AMD Radeon RX 570 8GB, he managed to score that last minute for just £50. Of course, the AMD Wraith Stealth cooler was included with his CPU, but that brings the total to £143.95. So our contestant is well within budget here, and I'm actually really surprised at how much they actually got for that kind of money. It wasn't that long ago that this system would have cost you at least double that in components, and if you were buying it pre-built, it'd double as well, because they don't seem to be any cheaper when you do that nowadays. But how well does it perform when it comes to our test suite? For those of you that watch the previous series, you will know that our test suite is made up of games that are old and new, and they test different elements of a system like this. You can't expect too much from a £150 gaming PC, but generally these games give it a good overall test, so you can kind of see what kind of performance you would get. The first game up is GTA 5. Now GTA 5 is quite an old game now, but one that can still be quite demanding, but also it had no issues for this system. At 1080p with a high preset, this little system can achieve 80 frames per second on average with a 1% low of 50. With this kind of performance, not only does the game look great, but it is also a very smooth experience with no major stuttering like previous systems before. Mad Max runs beautifully on this system, even handling 1080p with a very high preset with ease, where it managed to get an average FPS of 107 with a 1% low of 84. This is a near high FPS experience here and really does go to show what having 8GB of VRAM can really help you achieve with these things, because with this game you could really ramp up those graphics presets and it didn't really affect performance at all. In The Witcher 3, this system performed very similar to all of the other previous systems. The updates to this game have made it much more demanding than previously, and as these systems are very close in performance, that could be the reason why. But overall with this system, the game actually runs much more smoother, and I think that's down to the 8GB of VRAM on the graphics card. With this, we managed to get an average of 58 frames per second with a 1% low of 43. It means that the game was more than playable, and it was a great result for a low-cost system just like this. In Shadow of the Tomb Raider, this system managed to get a very playable experience. Running the game at 1080p with a high preset was no issue at all, where we managed to get an average of 64 frames per second with a 1% low of 48. The game looked absolutely great and it provided a very smooth experience, which was awesome because this is a great game to play. With our 8GB of VRAM, we can now increase the graphics preset on Doom Eternal, which provided an awesome visual result. Running the game now at 1080p, but this time with a nightmare setting, this system still managed to get a near high FPS experience, getting an average of 93 frames per second with a 1% low of 70. This is definitely the type of system you would need for this kind of game because it guarantees one heck of an experience. The last game in our testing is Cyberpunk 2077, and again, like all of the previous systems, it really did put this system to the test. To just about get a playable experience here, we had to run the game in 1080p with a low preset while enabling FSR 2.1 with a balanced setting. With these settings, the system managed to achieve an average of 52 frames per second with a 1% low of 30. It's not the greatest result and the visuals are very questionable, but it's reasonably playable if you really wanted to play this game. Now overall, the system performed exceptionally well, and even though the results were very similar to the previous entries, we did notice that this system was much more smoother when it came to that experience. And I think some of that is down to how well balanced the system actually is. The Ryzen processor actually does hold the line here, managing to allow the graphics card to get to its full potential, and then the 8GB of VRAM on the graphics card allowed us to raise up those graphics presets to get a better visual picture, and I think overall it did really well. But of course, for our competition, we have to actually retest those games again with a standard preset so that we can compare it with others, and for that, of course, we've gone for 1080p high, and some of those games didn't perform as well as they should. When it came to GTA 5, of course, we could run that game in the same settings, so we got an average here of 80 with a 1% low of 50. Mad Max now running in just a high preset, we managed to get an average of 126 frames per second with a 1% low of 95. That actually does now give us a high FPS experience, or at least in my opinion. The Witcher 3 got the same results of 58 frames per second on average with a 1% low of 43. And then when we come to Shadow of the Tomb Raider, again we got the same here of 64 frames per second on average with a 1% low of 48. Lowering the settings down to just a high preset though on Doom Eternal, we managed to get an average of 118 frames per second with a 1% low of 77. That one in my opinion is nearing a high FPS experience now. But then when it came to Cyberpunk 2077, the game became quite unplayable, only managing to get an average of 32 frames per second with a 1% low of 27. Now I say that Cyberpunk 2077 here was reasonably unplayable. For many, 30 frames per second was perfectly fine, but the game was very choppy just because of that 1% low, and you really wouldn't want to play it at those kind of configurations. So you really do need to enable the customizations to get any decent performance out of it. So now that we know how well the system performs, was it enough to beat our previous contestants? For our performance leaderboard, we actually take an average across all of those games, and in the instance of this machine, it managed to get an average of 80 frames per second. That actually means that it takes second place, which is a fantastic result. With our second leaderboard, we calculate how much each of those frames costs, and in the case of this system, it was £1.81 per frame. That actually allows this system to take third place, so we are starting to see people going in and out of the boards now, and I think overall it was a fantastic result for this system. So today's contestant did exceptionally well, but they didn't manage to actually take the top of the leaderboard. They did really well on the performance one, taking second place. That is an amazing result, particularly with the limited budget that we've got here, and there's also a limitation in the kind of components that you can get. We are starting to see systems that are pulling from the same pool of components, and that's mostly down to how much things cost. Over time, things should get cheaper though, so we should start seeing some even higher spec systems, and hopefully then somebody else can take the top of the leaderboard. But for now, Neddy990 still has that leaderboard place. I want to thank PC Jack for taking part in this series. He built a pretty decent system and it's given me some parts that I can really have a play with going forward. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you like this kind of content. We're going to have more episodes going forward. We're going to be lining up the next contestant soon. And I'm sure as always, I'll catch you guys in the next one.